Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for choosing this session. How are the energy levels doing? Are we feeling good? Yeah? Good. Excellent. Well, we've got an eclectic panel for you here with four very interesting and quite different perspectives. We've got two senior development executives. I'll give more color and clarification in due course. We have one CEO, and we have a legal eagle. So we've got the big with Saurabh from Louvre on the end there, and the big is about to get bigger after the acquisition by Xinjiang of his business. We've got the new kid on the block in terms of Mike in the middle there from GLH. Raise your hand, Mike. Is it excellent? I missed out Paul Pisani from Corinthia Hotels, and the legal eagle I mentioned is none other than Alex Campbell from Phil Fisher. Now, Alex is from the Structured Finance and Derivatives Group, which fortunately for us includes hotels. And sweet spots for him are acquisition, development, refurbs, finance, and of course, advising on management contracts and franchise agreements. His recent deals have included helping to refinance a Savoy debt, advising a mutual client in Dominus on some of their hotel developments, and advising on the hotel management agreements for Mondrian on the Sea Containers House project in London and the Indigo Brighton, etc., and more exotically in the Mondrian Istanbul and the Banyan Tree in Baia Phoenicia. Turning back to Saurabh there from Louvre Hotels. Louvre is the second largest European hotel group, as I say, now owned by Xinjiang. 1,100 hotels across 47 countries, and the Louvre Hotel Group is also a shareholder in Concord Hotels also. They cover the full quality spectrum from 1-star to 5-star, from Premier Class to Campanile to Kyriad, and Kyriad Prestige, Tulip Inn, Golden Tulip, I'm now at 4-star, through to Royal Tulip, their 5-star offer. And looking at the hotel count across those brands, it's 248, 399, 234, 80, 141, and 11 Royal Tulips. So an extensive portfolio across the piece, over 90,000 rooms, I believe. And I think key to us in this particular session, of those hotel rooms, 28% of the portfolio is owned and managed, 26% is operated under a hotel management agreement on behalf of the owners, and 46% are franchised. With a background in operations and consulting, Saurabh is a conference regular, and since joining Louvre in June 2012, has been spearheading their drive into Brazil, Russia, India, China, Indonesia, South America, and South Africa. So he can bring a very broad perspective across the brand piece, but also in terms of geography. Moving to Paul. Paul is Senior Vice President, Hotel Development, Corinthia. The luxury 10-strong Corinthia hotel chain was founded by three brothers, the Pisani brothers in 1960, one of which, George Pisani, is Paul's dad. And in London, they have the wonderful Corinthia Hotel, which may be familiar to a number of you. And when I asked Paul about some of the awards that Corinthia had won, he proceeded to send me a 2-page attachment to an email, which is just too lengthy to read, but believe me, it's impressive. And a couple of things that I picked out from the bio, and also looking on the internet, a bit of research for this, is the kind of Corinthia ethos, which I'll just share a couple of points. To provide hospitality as we do is a timeless craft, as old, challenging, and inspirational as that of being a master stonemason, goldsmith, painter, or musician. The spirit of Corinthia is the way in which we value authenticity, the trouble we take on individual details, grounded with a style that's discreet rather than merely ostentatious. All of these are the little ways we try to make a big difference, which I think is a great focus on quality at the very luxury end of the market. Now, moving to Mike. I'm delighted that Mike could join the panel, because for those of you who've met Mike already, I don't know how many in the audience have, he really is something of a tour de force, likened by his colleagues, I'm told, to Buzz Lightyear, having adopted his to infinity and beyond motto. Now, Mike's new to the hotel sector. He's also new to Berlin, so we could always ask him what he thinks of Berlin. And he's wonderfully unencumbered by the sort of conventions and mores by which we run our business. And if you look at his bio, he's been an ex-bank chairman and CEO of Standard Chartered, an exec of Procter & Gamble and PepsiCo, and I think at one time Mike was responsible for no fewer than 1,000 KFC outlets. So, unencumbered by hotel convention, as I mentioned, Mike is set to work transforming the former Thistle Hotels, which incidentally is London's biggest hotel owner-operator, into the GLH portfolio of brands in 2013. He's been reinventing, rejuvenating, and resuscitating the hotel operating model with the introduction of VCGMs, Value Center General Management. And he's been busy launching new brands with Amber and Every, which have debuted on the London scene recently, with Claremont soon to follow. A lot happening in his space. Now, these brands have been forged on the back of conjoint research. I could ask you a show of hands for those of you who know what that is, but it's a statistical technique used in market research to determine how people value different attributes, features, functions, and benefits that make up a product or service. And that would probably warrant a whole panel session on its own. But it's a very interesting and innovative focus to redefining brands to give them optimum relevance and value to their owners. But before I leave, Mike, questions for the audience. Do the words Spartathlon, Brazil 135, State 508, or Badwater 135, or Likey's 6633 mean anything to anybody in the audience? Right. Well, Mike is addicted to these things. They're not sort of prescription medicines, but they are seriously extreme sporting pursuits. And if we run out of steam during the course of this session, we'll have an opportunity for Mike to tell us about them and pose questions. But they are genuinely life-threatening, and I know that his legal team will be keen that he takes all the necessary precautions on his forthcoming challenge, I think somewhere in Alaska in sub-zero temperatures. So, panel, did I miss anything in that quick roundup of you? Anything you'd like to say? Good. Now, we want this to be interactive, this session. I know panel sessions can sometimes be you're just observing a set of anodyne, pre-scripted, pre-prepared questions. That is not in the case. In this one, we genuinely do not have anything pre-prepared, pre-scripted. It will be live. Now, what I would like to do, having told you all about the panel, I think it's only fair that the panelists get a sense of the complexion of the audience. So would any hotel owners like to put their hands up? Excellent. Operators? Excellent. Funders? Okay. Advisors? Excellent. And lawyers in particular? Great. Okay. Could all those that are, this is their first IHIF Berlin, put their hand up? Cool. Excellent. Okay, now everyone, if you could put your hands down, everybody that didn't put their hand up as a first timer, could you all put your hand up, please? Okay. If this is your, well, I was going to say, if it's your second Berlin, you can drop your hand. If it's your third, I want to get an idea. But okay, we got a good mix. I think a good mix of first timers, a good mix across the sort of operating model. Now, using some old technology, I've got 4 flip charts. What I want to do is to ask each of the panelists in turn, because topic, of course, is innovative management contracts, breaking the mold, and what should be excluded from a contract. I'm going to ask each of them to nominate what term or obligation or issue or item do they think should be taken out of a management contract and why. And there'll be some very different perspectives. And we'll work our way through, but they're not allowed any repeats. And I'm hoping that by doing that over a number of times, we can generate a list which we can then narrow down to perhaps a top 5 at the end of it all, so that you've got something to take away as top 5 items that talk to this topic. Now, having asked who's in the audience, I would like you to interject if you wildly disagree with something or there's a burning point you wish to make, as long as it's not too self-serving and doesn't go on for too long. I'd like you to do that. I want this to be your session and to get the most out of it. And I'm conscious that energy levels may be flagging, so we'll keep it lively. Right. Saurabh, would you like to start?
Sure.
What would be your starter as a term you would like to see excluded?
Being an operator, it was actually a very difficult exercise to find out those 5 points. There's a good support from operators there in the audience as well, and I'm sure you'll agree that when we do a management agreement, we try to balance it out in such a way that it addresses our need. So it's very difficult from our side to take out things. So if you allow me, I'll give you...
You're allowed to say what you want to go in, perhaps.
Yes, or perhaps modify.
Yeah, sure.
My first one's termination clause. I know it sticks up all the time. It's never aligned.
I only want 1, by the way. Don't give me 5 in one go. Only 1.
Okay.
So termination clause.
Termination clause.
And could you just elaborate on that for the audience as to why?
Yeah, so it sticks out all the time. I think this is a clause where it's not aligned at all. Sometimes owners ask for very tedious termination clauses. Sometimes operator asks for very tedious termination clauses. I think the balance has to be right, and this is something we'll discuss when this point comes up.
Okay, great. Thank you. Paul?
Well, again, very similar to Saurabh. I've sought to keep my operator hat on rather than the owning side. We do manage many of the hotels we actually own, but taking this purely from an operator's perspective, a management agreement in its pure form is a branding service relationship which an operator offers to an owner. And my point number one is that the default position should not include skin in the game. Whether this is in the form of key money, guarantees, or such like. When we quote fees, it's on the basis of a service which is to be provided, and therefore if one is to add more to that, then I believe the risk-reward ratio should be compensated accordingly.
So no skin in the game?
Yes. No skin in the game as a default position.
Okay. Mike, what's your number one?
Well, there's a saying that saints are sinners that never gave up. So we were a sinner. Okay, we have management contracts when I came in. They're very long term. They're very structured and onerous. I wouldn't sign one as an owner, personally. So I would expect no other owner to sign one in the future. So what we're going to do is I would have no tenor more than 5 years. 5-year tenor with 2 years notice. And at every 5 you could renew. If you needed something from your bank financing where the bank wanted 2 extra 5s at their option, I would do that. But I would shorten the tenor of the agreement dramatically. I don't think that there's any way that any brand company can justifiably commit to providing value over a 10, 20, or 30-year term.
Okay, good. Thank you. It's a contentious one.
Obviously,
Alex?
I think taking one of the many points that often get negotiated and takes a lot of time are discussions around contractual FF&E, so contractual fixtures, fittings, and expenditure arrangements. How is the relevant percentage determined? Who determines it? By what reference? By what standard? I think it's a provision in contracts that still need a lot of negotiation and a lot of movement.
And would you tuck into that the control over how it's spent?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay. Audience, does that prompt any questions or points to throw in at this juncture? Sounds like a no. Okay, that's our first run. Thank you. Sarah, what's the next one for you?
A term called ROLO. I would like to, and this is a Christmas wish list.
Rollover.
So, yeah, right of last offer.
Okay.
So if, just to put it in simple words, if an owner is selling his hotel, we as an operator would like to have a right of last offer to that property.
So that means what you can match the.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Paul?
One of the clauses we tend to stick on is what happens in the case of third-party claims, in terms of, hypothetically, an accident happening in a hotel, for example, and a client suing the hotel. Now, obviously, the hotel is not a legal entity, so who does one sue? Is it the hotel owner? Is it the hotel operator? And typically, in this sort of situation, it's everybody. And again, what typically an operator earns out of a hotel management agreement is not commensurate with that level of risk. And therefore, from our point of view, we seek to cap it, or at least limit our exposure. So this is something that I believe many of the bigger brands, especially the American brands, are very sticky on, and we've adopted a similar position.
to limit your exposure in the event of third-party claims.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yep. Please.
When you say your exposure, is it as owner or as operator?
As operator.
What I should have said at the beginning, there's a microphone we have roving, and if with Simone, I think, coming down the aisle there. So do raise your hand, and if some of you would rather put a question on a piece of card and have that asked by one of the students, by all means do, if you'd like to stay below radar. Good. Okay, Mike, your second.
I think I would put up that, well, if it was a 5-year contract, you could do it at renewal. But if it wasn't a 5-year contract, I think there should be a 3 to 5 year review of charges that are increasingly impossible to justify in the industry. I think paying commissions on commissions is ridiculous for an owner to pay brand fees on OTA commissions. The brand assurance is increasingly being provided by social assurance on TripAdvisor. If the brands were truly justified in charging the brand fees, then you would see a much closer pattern on TripAdvisor of where any of the big global brands were distributed. But statistically, they're randomly distributed through the rankings. So, and then rewards, I think, is another common sort of issue. So if you have a 5-year contract and you can give notice on 24 months, then that could be part of the new brand standards discussion every 5 years. If not, I think the industry should move to a contract where what can be seen as reasonable fees 20 years ago before the sort of digital inroads happened are now unreasonable, I think, in some ways. They need to be, I think, contested. It's a bit like that joke where a bear jumps out of the bushes and 3 hikers take off running, and then 2 of the hikers stop to put on their shoes, and the 3rd hiker says, "What are you doing? You can't afford to outrun the bear." And they say, "We don't need to outrun the bear, we just need to outrun you." And unfortunately, they're talking to the owner, and I think it's the OTAs and the brand guys who are putting on their shoes. And being a brand guy, I can understand that, right? So I think the fees are, there's too many ice cream scoops out of the owner's return. If you look globally, there's a $2 trillion investment in properties, in hotel properties. The OTAs have invested no more than tens of billions in their offer. The brands, no more than probably 10 billion or tens of billions again. How the risk reward can be so distorted where the return on equities for the OTAs range from 20 to 40%, the return on equities for the big brand companies range from 40 to 80%, and the return on equity for the owners is in single digit. There's something horribly wrong with the risk reward distributions, I think, in the industry today.
You always get thought-provoking answers from Mike. But that was a 3 to 5 year review of charges. And would you lump together the base and the incentive fee within that, as well as the group services? You're looking at the whole package of charges. Okay.
All of it.
Okay.
Even the central reservation charge, which can be $9 every reservation. They call the call center.
Okay.
Right.
Good. Alex.
So another clause I always end up having to negotiate and spend a lot of time talking about is who owns the guest data. So I would say information about customers and really guest data.
So what you'd like, clarification as to who owns it?
Clarification, exactly, because there's always a lot of debate around, can an owner, once a hotel management agreement has been terminated, keep the names and addresses of the customers? Can they have other data that the operator may consider is unique and sensitive to perhaps how the brand itself is operated?
Okay, good. Any questions after that run across the panel? Stupefying them. Saurabh, what's your next one?
A non-disturbance clause in all agreements.
Do you want to elaborate on what that is for those in the audience that perhaps might be unclear?
Yeah, essentially, I mean, should an owner default on his or her mortgage payments, it's just the bank, if they take over the property or whatever, they let the operations carry on the way it is and not interfere sort of with cash management and all that, and let the operator do what they're supposed to do.
So you want them in?
Yeah.
Paul?
What I would like to see is a revisiting of the area of protection clause, you know, the AOP, whereby typically hotel brands are precluded from operating another hotel of a similar brand or of the same brand within a geographic location. There's pluses and minuses to this clause, and I think it just needs to be readdressed globally, because there is value and merit to be had in clustering, you know, without necessarily hotels competing against each other. So rather than remove, I would just like to see this readdressed or revisited on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
And if I can add to it, it should work both ways. You know, and you know, if we have a mutual exclusivity, well, if you have an exclusivity on a hotel, and the next hotel owner develops, I mean, we should be given that right as well.
Okay. If anyone's not clear on any of the sort of phrases or terms that are used, just put your hand up. We'll ask the panel to make sure they elaborate on that particular point. I don't want you going away not being clear on points that are being made. Mike?
I would very gently, carefully, and solicitously shred the non-disturbance clause. I think it is a ridiculous requirement. The argument is that bankers want it. I was a banker for 25 years. Bankers do not want it. If the property failed, it failed for a multiplicity of reasons, one of which was probably the current operator. And to try and sell that with a management contract of a failed hotel reduces the EBITDA multiple you can sell it at. So I would say the non-disturbance clause should never, ever grace a management contract. But it's not a strongly held opinion.
I was going to say, did anyone find that answer a little too ambiguous for their liking? Okay. Alex?
Yeah, performance tests in agreements as a ground for being able to terminate hotel management agreements, poor performance of the operator. The trouble with those is there's always an argument to suggest that they act more as a stick rather than a meaningful ability to enable owners to terminate. They're very difficult, actually, in a lot of cases to breach. So I think a sort of development on how performance tests are drafted, possibly allowing owners to have grounds to terminate, not just on the sheer economic arrangements, perhaps, but changes to the reputation of the brand, which gives the owner a bit more control, and also how you measure performance. People typically look at it by reference to money, but perhaps people will in the future be looking a little bit more about feedback on things like TripAdvisor. You know, if a particular customer is looking to stay for a couple of nights in Manchester, they might be tempted to sort of type in TripAdvisor and have a look at what the top 10 hotels are, rather than looking out at a particular brand.
Like on that point, I mean, when folk are booking hotels themselves, how many will routinely have recourse to TripAdvisor in the audience? It's probably almost half, isn't it? Maybe a little bit less. Okay. Do performance tests work? Have we got an example of one actually working?
I haven't actually worked on one where it's ever led to a termination, but I'm sure that's probably has happened.
I digress. There must be some. Oh, we have a question here. Another question here. Oh, great. So let's take those. If you'd like to say perhaps where you're from.
Yeah, from Italy, Orvat HTL, Italy. Getting back to the fees, can we do a question on the fees from Mike Denoma?
Sure.
Denoma?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, this was quite a very interesting point. And looking from an Italian standpoint, where you have a very small penetration of chains, and you have a lot of independent operators doing very well in prime cities and secondary locations. Don't you think that these fees which are proposed today by majors are too much standardized, and they come from other markets where the penetration rate is higher, and where independent operator do not perform very well? That's why they ask the support of brands. So the question is, do you think they could be less standardized and more focused on the country situation?
Yeah, I think they should be much lower, overall. I don't see how the brands can justify in total 12 to 14% of the revenue. And we have our brands, and we wouldn't attempt to try to justify that. If you have no investment in the asset, the only true possession you have as a brand owner is the ability to continue to provide outstanding service and innovation to the guests in the hotels. I don't think that's the priority of the 9 global majors today. I think the priority is to manufacture contracts, frankly. I don't see them breaking ranks because it's all they've got, frankly. So I think it's a real challenge. I think in their defense, when the contracts were written 20 years ago, it was a different world, right? There was the many-to-many problem. They helped solve that. They helped with the GDS code. They helped with dealing with all types of different channels. Well, today, Airbnb has proven that you can sell any room in the world to any person in the room, and the marginal cost of selling an extra room is 0. So what's going to happen is the world is going to move to low-margin, digitally efficient solutions. I think what the OTAs and the brands are doing is not wrong. I think they're just charging dramatically uneconomic rent for doing it. They should be in the 3% range, like Airbnb. I think the brand's charging 3% as a franchise fee, and I think Airbnb or the OTA's charging 3% is a market clearing rate for a return on investment that would be reasonable for what they're actually putting in. And I think that's the way the world will end up going one way or the other. In the meeting before this, it was quite funny, is the brand guys said, "Oh, we don't think the OTAs are a threat," and everybody in the audience is going, "Liars, liars." And then the OTA guy said, "We don't think Airbnb is a threat," and everybody's going, "Liars, liars." And so, there's a relative lack of honesty, I think, in most of these meetings. But if somebody said, what's the elephant in the room? I think everybody's in the elephant. It's so big. I mean, the industry is under severe disruptive attack. And who's suffering? The owners, the customers, and the employees. Who's winning? The big brands and the OTAs. But
Great.
David,
but I'm new to this, so I may be wrong.
Yeah, go. This is probably
I may be back next year,
Paul.
and I may be going, everything is fine.
I think people are liking this. They're
I don't
liking
know
the
about
candor. They're liking the creative thought. And as I say, it's unscripted. We want this debate to be live, so let's get it going.
No,
Paul,
I have a
I'll come back to you, Neil, in a minute. Your question.
I take on board what you said, but from a fee perspective, I'm sure you'll appreciate that not all the fees that are collected are actual profit to the operator or to the brand. Of course, it varies by brand, but looking at our own brand, we reinvest about 70% of the fees we actually collect to eventually, enhance our offering, to improve our service standards, our training, our platforms, etc. So I think it's a bit misguided to say that it's all profit to the operator. Operators would tend to argue it's not.
Yeah. I'm not saying that it isn't, that it's wasted. What I'm saying is that it's the owner that put up the CapEx of significant amounts. The owner is taking the significant risk. The brand risk, I've heard in these discussions, we're risking the brand. Who's risking their brand? Look at the global majors' distribution across TripAdvisor in any city in the world. They're not in the top hotels. They're distributed randomly through it. Okay, so I just think it's past its day. I mean, how can everyone take so much percentage out with no capital at risk? I just find it extraordinary. I don't think it'll continue. As I always tell people in our company, the parasite can't kill the host. Now, it seems to be making a good run at it, but I think what the owners will do, there will be a reversion to the mean for the OTAs and for the brands on a return on equity or return on capital. And I think there'll be offers out there that charge a more reasonable return for marketing a room to any person on the planet.
It's different business models. I mean, people who own hotels, they own it for real estate, for appreciation, for other reasons. Our business model is operating hotels, and that's what we do. I mean, we do own some hotels for that reason, which the owners own hotels. So they're completely different business models. I mean, of course, things are evolving. What things were 20 years back, as you said, are no longer the same. 30 years contract was a norm back in 80s and early 90s. Now it's almost unheard of. So things are evolving, and I'm sure mutually we'll get there. But it's a different business model.
Well,
Mike, if I could make one
Yeah.
point. I mean, I guess you own and operate hotels.
yeah, I own and
so-
operate them, and we have management contracts. So
Right.
I
They
have
must
as
have some
many
great. They must have some great terms.
I have as many management contracts as I do as owned hotels. But having the owned hotels makes you realize on the risk-reward spectrum, where is the real risk? Now, I think you're right, but here's what I don't understand on the math. Okay, if you add up the math on a management contract, it can be 10% or more, right? You can get a franchise for 3%, and you can hire an interstate or someone in Europe for about 1%. So, okay, 3% plus 1% is 4%. How does that compare to 10 or 12?
But I wouldn't say it's 10 or 12. I
No.
think in today's
Yeah.
world, it's more like 5 or 6.
No, if you add in the marketing, if you add in the rewards, you add in all the crap, it's 12 to 14.
But that's cost.
Come on. Every booking. Okay, so the other thing we did is we had a central reservation unit, and it would come in. We had 140 people. So I said, okay, let's get rid of the central reservation unit. Have it go into the hotels at no extra cost. So we came up with a technical solution to do that. And the rating of people calling went from a top box score of 5, from 20% to 70%. They're much happier calling the hotel. Now, technically, you can do it. Now, everybody says that's a cost, but frankly, I think it's a profit center in some ways for the big brands. There was a late night host in the United States who said, we should take all those steroids out of the Olympic athletes and put them back into the 80-year-old testicles where they belong. And I think that's what we should do with the reservations, Put them back into those 80-year-old testicles, right? I mean, and quit charging them for it.
That's quite a strap line. Nuno, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, one for Mike as well. I mean, I'm liking a lot of what you're saying, and you and I are going to sign a lot of contracts. You're going to have plenty of flags all over Europe pretty soon. But I want to put myself in your shareholders' shoes. 5-year contracts, no NDAs, shredding this, shredding that. How does that affect share value, your share price, risk to kind of your owning company as a brand? And I understand you're an owner and an operator, but some of the brands are just brands.
Well, I think it's a good point. I think what's happening in the world today, I think the world's changed, and I love this industry. I love being in it. It is a bun fight. It is a fun little bun fight going on. But the world's moving to on-demand, no commitment, usage-based pricing. That's where the world's moving. Let's be frank. Airbnb is only if you sell it. Same with an OTA, right? So in some ways. So the world's moving to that, which means you have to be good and stay good, right? So the brands are in this surreal world where you don't have to be good or stay good. And that used to be okay. TripAdvisor had 10 million reviews in 2010. By the end of this year, they'll have 200 million. It's extraordinary change. The metabolic rate of this industry is glacial. The metabolic rate of the rest of the world is extremely rapid, right? And unfortunately, this one hasn't reacted. And that's why the OTA Vikings came running in your front door and are sitting down at dinner with you, because who let the Vikings in, And then, so it's a challenge, right? Now, I do think you can get it back. What we found is if you want to disintermediate an OTA, have direct contact with the customer at the hotel level. If you can do that, you'll surprise them dramatically and do something quite special for them. But then the big brands have this problem. Who owns the customer? Is it the owner? Is it the frequent guest program? Is it one of the owners' hotels in that city? Is it both of the owners? It's all confused. The antidote to the OTAs and everyone else is that the management of the hotel has to go back into the hotels. The servicing of the guest has to go back into the hotels, I think, right?
But should it be an or an and?
An or an and. Well, which would?
As in, direct interface with the customer
Yeah.
versus indirect. I think it should be both.
Well, I think what happened in the world is that the industry evolved from 30 years ago with a many-to-many problem. So if you were a hotelier, you had to use all indirect channels. You had to. You had no choice. And that's how we've gotten to where we are today. All these indirect channels have evolved. None of them have gone away. They're still here. But then what came in is the OTAs came in a direct channel. And people want to book direct. And it's putting huge pressure on all the indirect channels, right? Massive. And then Airbnb came in even more to say any room to anyone, in a sense, right? So what's happened is it is now possible to put every room on your every room in one of the hotels you have individually on a website to every person in the world at very little cost. If you would use Amazon Web Services, you could do it for less than $1 per room. And then you've got that for years, $1 per room, right? So I just think the world's changed. The industry got caught in a bit of a time warp, kind of weird thing going on. This is kind of a time warp conference, a little bit. I mean, in the sense of, because the brands host it, I don't know, some of the issues don't seem to get, I'm just surprised there's not more real issues discussed in these conferences versus everybody trying to explain why it's okay that OTAs are taking such a huge part of the reservation, and the same with the brands. So.
Sure. Got a question here?
Yeah, as a small owner-operator who owns some of their properties and manages some of their properties, my small version experience
Yeah.
is what I think you're beginning to see as a large version experience. What I find is that I make so much more money on the real estate, like to the multiples, insane quantity of money, very easy. And I find the management side of our business to be highly complicated and pretty unprofitable. You're finding the opposite. So are you moving much more into management? Because I'm moving much more into ownership because it's just such a much better game.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what's happened though is that for the brands to justify their fees, they had to de-skill the hotels. Does that make sense? So if you want to justify your fees, you have to make sure that that you can prove your value. So revenue management has been pulled out of hotels pretty much. Branding has been pulled out. Marketing has been pulled out. When I first came in our company, I thought, wow, our general managers were more like parking lot attendant. Card pull up, they'd give them a chit to Bay 92 because they weren't allowed to do anything, really. They weren't profit accountable. So what we're finding is we put a whole nother layer, we call them VCGMs, profit accountable managers. We split the hotel. They're responsible for a P&L. We charge them a cost of capital as well. They're in charge of doubling economic profit every 3 to 5 years. It's a cool job. And we put revenue management back into the hotel. Revenue management, I came from banking. Revenue management at the hotel level is like foreign exchange trading. It is that sophisticated. You are selling forward at least 365 days, right? Different rooms, different pricing, different competitive sets. I mean, it's very sophisticated decision science if you put it in the hotel. And the reason it's so exciting if you put it in the hotel, they can make all those necessary trade-offs between different channels and segments and targets. And that's where we're finding things work. And when you put all that back into the hotel, the ownership of the guest experience goes up. We introduced one of our new brands. We had a hotel Charing Cross. We refurbished it, rebranded it. It was number 250 on TripAdvisor in London out of 1,064 hotels. It is now, I think 3 months after rebranding, number 11. Number 11. So something's working, Now, the first one may be accidental, so you should check with me maybe a couple months from now and see if we've done some more. But I think management's been pulled out of the hotel industry, in a sense. And the hotel schools teach the craft. There's no science. These should be some of the best jobs in the world. You go in, you've got a huge decision science component, and you got management experience. So.
And I just wonder, do you have the same passion around American Express and their 3.5% fee as you do, say, a Hilton or a Sheraton's 3?
You mean in the amount they get?
And how unfair it is, considering what American Express contributes to
Oh, yeah.
day-to-day business?
Okay, this is a perfect example of
Why did you ask him that?
Okay, this is a perfect example of uneconomic rent. Okay, I used to have credit card businesses, very large ones, right? And I ran the global consumer bank for Standard Chartered for a decade. I was at Citibank. When there's 3 people coming down the highway and you've got the toll booth in your Visa or American Express or MasterCard, charging 2% or 3% is a reasonable return on what you invested, right? When there's 1 billion cars on the toll road, it's ridiculous, right? So that cost, I've calculated personally, the cost of a switch, a global switch, is maybe $10 million. It's probably not any more than a cost of 2 to 3 basis points on the cost side. It's the same issue that we have now. That is exactly the same as the fees in the hotel industry. There is an uneconomic return. Now those fees will continue to come down and come down and come down, and that's why peer-to-peer payments are coming. That's why the banks are being disintermediated from payments, right? It's much more of a pay-as-you-go model.
Thanks, Mike, for that, and thanks for the questions. I'm just thinking in terms of the question about where the value sits and focus on operating agreements or the real estate itself. Sarah, your company's got a massive spread, and I went through the mix of ownership and operating model. Is there a priority within your business as to which you want to grow more? Or how do you focus that?
Yeah, I mean, our sort of strategy is to reduce the percentage for franchising and grow more through the management route in the existing markets. But for new markets, it's management route and acquisitions.
Good. I mean, Mike's been coming out with some pretty thought-provoking, controversial stuff. Quick show of hands, who kind of agree with all of that? We've got a bit of a split, even split actually. That's good. Do we have any other questions before we run for some other terms to be excluded? We have one at the back. Great. So I'd much rather be asking the questions that are coming from the floor, provided they stay on topic.
Dimitrios from Cubic Hotels. Again, just coming back to the fee structures, surely it's irrelevant because ultimately as an asset owner, you're looking for return on your asset ownership and it should be tied into other asset classes. So let's say if you're making 3-4% on the resi, you're making 5-6 on commercial offices and hotels are generating 7-8. That's the owner's perspective as opposed to does the operator generate value or not. As long as they're making their 7-8%, they're happy. And then the margin does belong to the operator.
That's more perhaps a statement than a question. Yeah, okay. Good. We have a question there. Thanks. Okay.
Question for Surab. I wondered how successful are you finding moving franchisees into management contracts? Because that seems to be going against what's happening with most chains and what most owners want at the moment.
So if I understand your question correctly, the question is how do we convert franchises to management agreements?
Yeah, I mean, how are you finding selling that? Because I think my personal experience is that owners want the opposite. They tend to want to go from managed to franchise, not the other way around.
Yeah, so most of our growth in management agreements is coming from countries or continents like Africa and Asia. That's where they really go after management agreements, and those are the regions where we don't encourage much of franchising. In Europe, it's a good balance between both management agreements and franchising. And I mean, you have a valid point. I mean, I would say some of our management agreements have been converted into franchise agreements as well. So there's a shift there. And in cases like that, we don't mind that because we know the owners, we know his capabilities, we know that the owner's been involved into the business for many years, and he can do it. He can do it to the same way as we were doing it. In many cases, we let him take over our general manager and do it. In many cases, he gets a good general manager and we approve it. So it works both ways.
Paul, what's the priority for Corinthia? I mean, going forward, what would you?
Well, in terms of positioning, we are positioning ourselves as a brand at the topmost level of luxury, and we are focusing almost exclusively on gateway cities, primarily in Europe at the moment, but looking at entry into the US as well. We will be doing this through a number of methods. Of course, a preferred route would be management, but invariably we tend to be very creative in the way we structure our management, and it's never a raw management agreement. And we do have the ability and the appetite to leverage our balance sheet as well. So it will be a mix of acquisition or part acquisition with the ultimate goal of having management agreement.
Good. Any questions before we eke out some more terms? Gentleman here. Did I wait for the microphones coming? Thank you.
Hi, Federico Chua from Marriott. A lot of the ideas that have been discussed have benefit either the owner or the operator, but typically not both. Like for example, a shorter term typically benefits the owner, but not the operator. So I'm thinking if you guys know of any ideas that would benefit both. For example, a simplification of the incentive fees would benefit both. We look sometimes at these cash flow waterfalls that need to be created to calculate how much the operator actually gets paid. Is there anything else that you can think of that can actually benefit both sides? Because I can see how difficult it would be to implement those things because one side wants one thing and the other side wants the other. But is there anything that can benefit both sides?
You think we're going to get them to agree? Sarah?
I guess we get into the complicated waterfall or cash flow waterfalls purely because we want to get a win-win. I mean, if as an operator we would welcome just a straight 7%, 10% incentive fee of a GOP, but that doesn't work for the owner. So just to get that win-win, it kind of gets into that complicated stage. And mostly it gets complicated from the owner's side because he's a bit risk averse and he wants to make sure he really incentivizes for the right performance. So in short, I'm not sure if there's an easy way out. In fact, it's going to get more complex.
But I guess picking up, the question here, because you've got the different sort of mindsets. If you take something like the length of the term, the challenge is to make that shorter term more equitable to both parties, and surely it's about adequate compensation to the brand. The brand wants to put a lot of effort in and get the long-term reward. But if there's a fairly if there's a transparent means by which the operator can say, look, for whatever reason, I want to change, I perhaps want to divest or whatever, here's a fee to compensate. It's then about the compensation. It's not going to be X times 25 years, but it might be, I don't know, X times 5 or something. So it's probably trying to make each of those, which are contentious, acceptable to both parties to protect and recognise both interests.
And one of the reasons an operator would typically go for a longer term or wish for a longer term is because of the way a hotel actually matures. If one's going for a 5-year term, in the knowledge that you don't get maturity before year 3, so from an operator's perspective, your window to make some pretty decent money is actually 2 years. So it has to be give and take.
And I think, Paul, you occupy a particularly special place with some very grand assets that do take a long time to evolve and perhaps achieve their optimum, as distinct to say, putting a Hampton by Hilton up or whatever, which could penetrate the market very quickly. Good.
And for us as well, for our mid-market brands, many of our contracts are 5 years. 5+5 is, we do that. But for luxury assets, no, it doesn't work out. And it's actually for owners' sake, it doesn't work out because you need to have that presence, you need to have that continuity. And end of the day, it's a brand. So people would know that hotel by that brand. And for that, you need that longer tenure.
I think it's very difficult because we were thinking about these topics in advance, and clearly some of them definitely are for the interest of the owner, and some for the operator, and where the two cross is fairly small. I think one of the things that we're hearing from owners is a brand coming in to manage their hotel really delivers in, say, the first 3 years where you have a building that is then recognised as a well-known hotel and then builds up a customer following. But after that, maybe the role of the brand is less important because you've already got a hotel that's up and running. But of course, that's it's the first 3 years that the brand has been investing all the money and the time. So whether there's a way of thinking about different ways to reward and to deal with fees at that first point, and then different for the next phase is one way of looking at it. And as we touched on earlier, I think the way the market is perceiving hotels and going out and staying in hotels is by reference to different benchmarks of excellence now. And whether I know something like TripAdvisor is a very subjective website that certainly isn't perfect data and information, but perhaps that might be a different benchmark of excellence that hotel operators can use as a way to demonstrate the value. So that I think is the exciting development in the hotel and leisure market that certainly we're seeing. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but what it does mean is that all parties, owners and operators, do both need to look at arrangements and how they demonstrate successes of hotels by reference to today's standards rather than even 3 years ago.
Conscious of time, we've got about 5 minutes. What I'd like to do is, perhaps starting with you, Sarah, you've heard the 12 terms, items, issues. Which would be your number one? Just trying to distill this down to a list. And conscious, it might sit both sides of the fence. Which would you pick you'd like to see out or in?
Yeah, the termination clause still. It's invariably, it comes up all the time, whichever country you go in.
It doesn't have to be your own one that you nominated. Okay. I'll come back to you, Paul, actually. I'll just go to Alex. From what you've heard, which one would you?
Well, it is difficult. I think I'd probably still stick with my first one, actually, contractual FF&E, partly because that one does touch on all sorts of things like control of expenditure and also control of FF&E expense linked to perhaps brand standards. So that particular point flows through all sorts of issues.
Okay. Paul, your point?
I'd go back to my risk-reward ratio point, which was the first one I made. But I think just as a final point, and it addresses this particular point, but also I think many of Mike's concerns, is certainly in the luxury space, there's no such thing as cookie-cutter approach to management agreements or anything. Certainly as a smaller company, we have the ability and the luxury to approach each situation on a case-by-case basis. Many of our larger competitors offer a relationship out of a box. In our case, there's no box. So it really has to be that way. And if the discussion is term, or if the discussion is, skin in the game, guarantees, or anything else, I think nothing is insurmountable if the objectives of all parties can, remain aligned for the duration of the term. So my final point would be, address each issue on a case-by-case basis. For some owners who are institutional, it's bottom line that they may necessarily be interested in. But for others, it may be the only asset within their portfolio, and therefore, relevance is important, and importance is equally important.
It's clearly the bespoke, tailored suit as far as Corinthians is concerned. Mike, what's your one that you want to see out in?
Well, when I first saw the management contract, I thought, this must be the worst contract in the history of the world, right, for hotels. But I found one worse, okay? This contract is actually worse than a hotel management contract. It is more onerous. It has got ridiculous clauses. It's absolutely absurd. Now, this is a contract for a Subway franchise, right? The franchise shop. Now, the interesting thing about this contract, no matter how bad it is, it's 30 days notice either side. So my point is, you can have horrible contracts that are short-term, and you can have extremely ridiculously long contracts that are benign. But you can't have horrible contracts that are long-term. So I would shorten the tenor to 5 years, keeps everybody honest, everybody has to play, everyone else has to keep earning the right to continue to charge.
Great. Excellent. And just before we go, Mike, can you very quickly tell us what this challenge is you're doing? Just briefly.
Okay, so I'm running, it's called the 6633. It's it's either 120 miles, 120 miles in the Arctic. I'm doing it for Grant a Wish. It's terminally ill children. They have wishes that, to see a certain soccer player ride in a car or ride on a plane. So we're looking to do 50 wishes. And what I have to do is it's a self-supported race. It's 30 below zero the whole race. And you pull a sled with all your junk in it, So.
And how long do you have to get into the sled before you start getting frostbite?
Oh, yeah. So the way it works at 30 below is the minute you stop moving, you have 2 minutes to get into your sleeping bag in the bivvy on the ground, or you start going hypothermic. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
extreme.
So on March 20th, if you want to follow, it's 6633. Which I asked the guy, why do you call it 6633? It's the latitude of the Arctic Circle.
Excellent. Great. Well, look, thank you all, panel. I think thank you, Alex. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Saurabh. Thank you, delegates. Enjoy the rest of the conference.